the California Preservation Foundation has organized this talk because I have kind of a mixed background, which is kind of pertinent to what I'll be talking about. I'm actually, like John said, I'm originally from Moscow, but I was raised in California. And while I was in California getting my master's in photography, I was given an assignment to photograph, to do a project that would copy the style of a master photographer. And out of this list of photographers, I noticed the name Alexander Rodchenko. And I recognized that it was a Russian name, so I went to Google, looked up his images, and I found this picture of the Shukov radio tower. And I can say that this was the beginning of my work with Avant-Garde. Before that, I had never heard of constructivism. I knew about the Russian Revolution, but I didn't know about, the art and architecture that followed it. And so my interest was basically sparked beginning with this photographer. And so as I was doing some research about his work, I was really kind of captivated by his use of angles, his dynamic perspectives. But I also discovered that he did, he was multidisciplinary. He did graphic design, he did sculptures, he did advertisements. But it was his photographs that really captured my eye, and it was also what he photographed. So he was photographing life during the 1920s in Soviet Russia, but it was the buildings in particular that kind of caught my eye. Like I said, I was raised in California, so I was used to that kind of architecture, but what I saw in his photographs to me looked a little different. And so I started doing some research about what constructivist architecture was. And you can see that was kind of the beginning of my curiosity in it. And so while I was in San Francisco getting my degree in photography, I was mostly focusing on architectural photography. So these are some of my photographs from San Francisco. And I was using kind of the same tactics as Rodchenko was using, the high contrast, the different perspectives of looking up. And when it came time for me to pick my thesis project, there was something that drew me to pick a project about Russia. And so basically I combined my interests in photographing architecture and this new to me movement that was constructivism. And I did some initial research, and in 2010, in summer of 2010, I went to Moscow for the summer and started searching out these buildings, because I didn't really have an idea if the buildings were still standing, what kind of condition they were in. And so basically for me, it was kind of like a treasure hunt. And when I arrived in Moscow, so the two pictures that we're looking at are the Mosloprom building, photographed by Rodchenko in the 20s. And then this is the same building in 2010. And so this was a very common thing. The buildings that I saw in his pictures, since they were recently built during that time, they looked very fresh, new, very in good condition. And the buildings that I experienced were run down, unkept, and to me that was, a very obvious contrast. Also for me, it was very exciting to go see the Shukov Tower, which was kind of the inspiration for me to get started in all this. For me, it was really interesting to be able to see something that was created so long ago and was still standing, and it was kind of part of the everyday cityscape. And a lot of times when I was photographing these buildings, people would come up to me and ask me, why are you photographing this structure? What's so special about it? And I would be kind of trying to explain to them. At that time, my Russian wasn't so good after being in California for so long, but I would be trying to explain to them about the Russian avant-garde, about the buildings and what they signified in architectural history. And a lot of times I got kind of interesting looks. And so I ended up doing my thesis work about constructivist architecture These are some of the photographs that I took during my time in 2011 when I was in Moscow for 11 months photographing. And so when I came back to California to actually produce the work for the thesis, I ended up developing a style where I would take the photographs that I shot on film. Like here we have the Ruskov Club by the architect Konstantin Melnikov. And I turned my photographs into silkscreen prints. So it was a way of combining photography, but then also to create a poster that would be informing of the year that it was built, and it was kind of like a promotion of the building. To me, even at that time when I wasn't quite aware of kind of all the details of kind of the struggle that avant-garde architecture was having in its preservation. But I knew that it was important to promote it, important to kind of give it an advertisement. So I picked about 18 buildings, and each of the buildings got their own poster. And so here are some photographs from the silkscreen process. We have, let's see. And so at the end of 2012, when I completed my degree at the Academy of Art in University in San Francisco, there was an exhibition of these posters. And basically, when I completed my degree, I realized that it was interesting to show my work in San Francisco. And actually, I had people comment to me saying that were people who had come from Moscow and said that was so strange for them to see these kind of works being highlighted in San Francisco. And that gave me the thought that I should also show my work in Moscow, because that was where kind of this battle was happening to save these buildings. And so what was my thesis work, the constructivist project, ended up being what I continued doing when I moved to Moscow in 2012. So that's kind of about how I got started working on this project, from a photography project where basically I was more interested in what the buildings looked like. Later on, I got more focused into what was their current fate and what people are doing about it. But I want to, at this point, kind of take a step back and look at the history of the avant-garde, because I know John was saying that most participants today are from California, and I'm not sure how much people know about the avant-garde. So I'm going to do a super quick glossing over of kind of what happened before the avant-garde and during. So here we're starting with the turn of the century, a few examples of what the architecture looked like before the style changed to constructivist architecture. As you can see, it's very decorated. It's something that you might see also in other European cities. And here, 1908, Pushkin Museum, built in 1912. And then we have World War I, which kind of interrupts things, and the revolution. Here I would like to kind of mention at the bottom of the slide, there's a link to a project called Project 1917. I think right now it's a very important time because there's a lot of exhibitions that are happening that are taking a look at the revolution, and considering kind of the history of constructivist architecture, that it was not to say directly inspired, but the revolution was really like the impulse that kind of broke with the past, that it's an important thing to take a look at. So by 1918, the capital had moved from Petrograd to Moscow. Oops, I pushed the wrong button. Okay, and we're back. And so Okay. Sorry, a lot of technical difficulties. Okay. So yeah, 1918, the capital returns to Moscow. And at that time, Moscow becomes again an administrative city. And the first construction, a major construction in Moscow at that time was the Shukhov radio tower. It was built by the engineer, built and designed by the engineer Vladimir Shukhov. And he had imagined this tower as being 350 meters. But because of the Civil War, metal shortages, really the economic hardships, they didn't have enough metal, so it ended up having to be cut in half. So it was only built to 150 meters. And this following photograph, you can see kind of what the architecture looked like at that time. We have about 2-story wooden houses, maybe 4 or 5, but everything was pretty low-rise. And then here we have this soaring 150 meters tall tower. And for me, it's always interesting to think about what people, when they saw these constructions at that time, I mean, what kind of reaction they had, how much of an amazing sight it is to look at. And then the fact that the same structure has survived to 2017, I think that's really interesting. In 1919, let's see. Again, I wanted to go kind of through this history part a little bit quicker just because I want to get to my photographs. So let's see, I'm going to go a little bit quicker. So after the Russian Civil War ended in 1922, the country started to, after the chaos of the Civil War, started to get more organized, and they could start building buildings for the new capital. As I said, in 1918, the capital had moved back to Moscow, and the city government had to fulfill, they had to build new administrative buildings, and people really looked to architects to design new buildings for this new era, also for the new ideals. Again, because the communists had a new way of looking about society, there was a new philosophy, and there was a new societal goals. And so they really looked to architects to kind of design a new future. A lot of times constructivist architecture is always thought of as utopian, something that looked to the future, and architects really played a role in designing what it looked like. Also, there was, in addition to kind of the purpose of the architecture, there was also the style. There was new aesthetics. On the right here, we have some of the plans, and then on the left, we have how the building was realized. This was the Izvestia building. It was a printing plant. As you can see, it's a lot more geometric, more machine-like compared to some of the earlier buildings that I was showing right here, like these ones that were done in more historical styles. So it's completely a break from the past. And by the mid-1920s, as the economy was starting to recover from the Civil War and the Revolution, these building projects really got underway. Besides the Shukhov radio tower, there were not that many buildings built in the early 20s. By the mid-20s, construction started. And so we have some, as here depicted, is residential complex. We have the famous Narkenfjord building, which I'll talk a little bit more specifically later. It was an experimental type of communal housing. We have the Melnikov house, another communal house with the Shukhov tower in the back. We have the Ruskov Workers Club. And as you can see, a lot of these buildings are completely visually very different from what happened before. And we have the Zil Palace of Culture, the Pravda printing plant, the Centre Soyuz building built by Le Corbusier. It was the only building that he had constructed in Moscow. The Centre Soyuz building. This building is interesting because its author is Alexei Shusov. And Shusov, before the revolution, had worked in the style, what was it, neoclassicist style, or yeah. And so when constructivism became the official style of the new Soviet government, he changed his aesthetics, and he was the author of this building. So it shows how architects adapted to the time. Science Institute, textile dormitories, student dormitories. Here, this is a very interesting building because it is, as you can see, very, very long. This longer part was the dormitory part, dormitories for the students. At that time, it was planned to house 2,000 students. And then we have this middle bridge in the right diagram. People would go from their dormitories, go through the communal part where they would bathe and wash, and then this left side was the part where they would have their lessons, and it was the communal space. So it was kind of like a machine for these students for where they had different places where they would sleep, where they would wash up, and also where they would have their school and their lessons. Here we have a department store, bread factory. This is an automated bread factory where materials would be start at the top, and by the end you would have a fresh loaf. So it was providing something something that was something like 20,000 loaves of bread per day to feed the population, and a Dynamo stadium. And so by 1932, after several years of constructivist architecture, really being kind of the state had the full kind of support of the state. When I say constructivist, I'm using it in the most like general term. There was actually many different architectural organizations working at the time. But it was all this modern architecture. It was all architecture that rejected historical styles, rejected this decoration, and it was more focused on function, on geometry, on machine-like aesthetics. By 1932, the Union of Soviet Architects was formed, and this forced combination of all these groups kind of signified this break between modern architecture, what was happening in the 1920s, and then an abrupt return to state-sponsored eclecticism. But this is not the end of constructivist architecture. There continued to be this dialogue between this new modern architecture and then this desire to return to things that were more traditional, like columns and decorative elements. But by 1936, all modern design was censored as formalist. And so this is kind of ends the brief little part about the history of the avant-garde, but the question that should be answered is, why is the Russian avant-garde significant? It was a very brief amount of time, but it ended up having a very impactful legacy. And as Zaha Hadid stated, the pace, quantity, and quality of the creative work in art, science, and design was truly astounding, anticipating in one intense flash what then took up to 50 years to unfold elsewhere in the world. The Russian avant-garde not only anticipated the urbanist concept of the 1950s, but projects were designed that anticipated the mega-structure utopias of the mid-60s and the high-tech style of the 1970s. Basically, what she was saying, that this short, very brief, short time produced such magnitude of creativity in architecture that it was continued to inspire future architects. And here I've collected a small little, not complete list, but a list of architects who were very much influenced by constructivist architecture, which originated in Russia. Here, as I know, for presentations, usually you don't want to put too many photographs on a slide, but this is kind of to show the range of creativity that was going on in the 1920s. I had just talked only about the architecture, but really it was multidisciplinary, where it was paintings, it was graphic arts, it was clothing designs, it was theater, it was photography, of course, like the work of Alexander Rodchenko. It was textile design, cinema, China, sculptures. I mean, it covered all the artistic fields. But a lot of the times, excuse me, the architecture is kind of one of the most remembered. And when people think of constructivist architecture, a lot of what was designed on paper was really, really ahead of its time. There was flying cities, there was horizontal skyscrapers, there was impossibly tall skyscrapers that at that time, due to the technology, couldn't be built. But nowadays, we definitely can recognize that these structures as our kind of modern day contemporary skyscrapers. But for me, what is really interesting about the avant-garde and avant-garde architecture specifically is that a lot of these designs that were on paper actually were built, and today we can go and visit them and touch them, and it's just a part of the history that you can actually see with your own eyes. And so here, for example, is the Zuyev Club, and we can see how it was designed, what it looked like back when it was first constructed. The picture in the middle is about from something in the 1980s or so, and the final picture is a couple years ago when it was painted from this yellow color to what now its current color is pink. So part of what I do now is to research what's happened to these buildings throughout the years. I have been working on this since about 2010. And so even during this brief, 7 years, I've seen how some of the buildings have been completely transformed in a short period of time, some of them unfortunately demolished. And so I'd like to, at this point, talk about what's happening to the buildings nowadays. So in 2017, some of the urban planning trends in Moscow, why I find it really interesting to be based here, and especially as a photographer, is Moscow is very much a city of contrasts in kind of all sorts of ways. Architecturally, you can see historic buildings next to the most shiny glass sculptures that are being built, as for example is pictured here, Moscow City. And across the riverbank is a factory. Unfortunately, in Moscow, even in the city center where the tourists are walking around and like not too far away from Red Square, we have a lot of buildings that are unkept. And it doesn't mean that they're in constructive style, but even just as this one, that is usually something that is usually easily protected. They're still falling apart and having a really hard time finding ownership that is going to put in the time and money to renovate them. Instead, it's a lot easier to demolish and then build something new. Here I've compiled a short list of, not all, but some of the main preservation challenges. Demolition by neglect, something that happens all too often with constructivist buildings that at this point they're about 80 years old. And so if a building is not upkept during the years, obviously it's going to fall into a poor state, and it's an easy way to just to deem the building in a dangerous condition and basically unsavable, and so it can be demolished. As pictured here, fires, or maybe the better term would be arson. It's an easy way also to bring a building to its kind of critical point to where it's demolished, or such things as when a building is planned to be quote unquote reconstructed, but in the end it's basically gutted and built anew. A lot of times, yeah, this is with constructivist buildings, it's I would have to say maybe they're more picked on than other buildings. And I often get the question of why that is. And if I knew that my job would be a lot easier, but I'm still trying to figure out kind of what are the main problems. And one, not only in all these kind of material threats where it's demolition to make way for new construction. That's kind of a typical thing that happens in big cities where the city is modernizing, and obviously you can't museumify a city and keep every single historical building, but constructivist architecture tends to be picked on a little bit more, and this is partially from an official bias. People who work in the government and who are responsible for deciding what is demolished or not, to misunderstand the significance of the architecture, to understand that these geometric buildings and their simplicity can be really beautiful. A lot of times officials tend to prefer buildings that are easily recognizable as being kind of, a masterpiece of architecture, if they have the columns on it, if they have some ornamental decorations on them. And especially when I was walking around Moscow and photographing kind of the buildings that are in poor condition. To me, it was interesting to see these buildings, but a lot of times people would come up to me and ask me, why are you photographing this like rundown piece of trash? And I had to kind of try to explain to them that, to explain the broader picture of what time period they came from, what the style meant, and yeah, so it's kind of often a battle to convince people why I found those buildings beautiful. This next slide I wanted to show when I had said, so officials kind of don't understand the architectural style, maybe the significance of constructivist architecture. Definitely the avant-garde is still known on an official level. These are two examples from the Olympics, one in Sochi and then this previous one in Rio, where part of the opening ceremony, there was 4 or 5 minutes dedicated to the avant-garde. And then this past Olympics, the Russian uniforms were designed after avant-garde designs. And so to me, I think there's a disconnect between kind of an appreciation and understanding of the significance of Russian avant-garde in graphics design, and then also significance of avant-garde as an architectural style. And this can be very easily seen in what the buildings look like in the present day. This is the Narkenfin building. This is a photograph I took last year. And it's, whenever I take like tour groups here, people always are amazed that this building is still, occupied. True that right now there's not that many people that are living there. It's mostly kind of small companies that are occupy the building, but still it's, I mean, you can see that it's kind of not seen, it's seen better days. Another shot of this building, and I mean, this was from a couple years ago, and I had some friends that were living in this building, and you can see just the very terrible condition that it's in. This photograph is what happens to constructivist architecture when a building's owner, who is obligated by law to take care of the monument. For example, the Narkenfin has regional status. the owner decided to start doing repairs without getting approvals. And so they were pouring cement in different parts of the building and basically fixing it up as, you know, as if it was any old building. And no matter how many phone calls we were making to the authorities to send somebody to investigate what was happening, it was basically, it went to deaf ears, and they continued doing repair works as they wanted to. The problem with this is in the future, if when kind of ideally a restoration would happen, it makes the restorer's job a lot harder, because a whole bunch of new layers have been added, and a lot of the kind of authenticity of the building was erased, kind of in this harsh way of dealing with the building. Plastic windows are often replace historical ones without preserving the old ones to kind of be able to rebuild them later. And yeah, this is right in the very center of Moscow. Behind it, if you see this building with the yellow lights on, that's the US Embassy building. So as I said before, Moscow is really a city of contrasts, where you have brand new buildings next to this building that it's kind of amazing that it's still standing. You have grass growing on its rooftop. This building also has trees that were growing out of it, and it was kind of turning its own little sculpture. And so if previously I was photographing the buildings, you know, on film, on black and white film, and I was interested in photographing in interesting perspectives, later in my work, I was kind of basically documenting its, I don't know, its destruction, and basically what was happening with the buildings. For example, here was, you can see how, this is also in the same building, how the police were called to investigate why this building, which has landmark status, was being remodeled without any sort of official approval. Later it was stopped, but then continued. And so basically it's kind of this nonstop fight with developers who don't respect the building, or basically decide to play by their own rules instead of adhering to the common best practices with historical buildings. And so this is some of the interiors before they were remodeled. You can see some of the interesting features, where it was the sliding windows. And this is a photograph of what the apartment looked like afterwards. So as you can see, it's very different. It's still a beautiful space, but at the same time, all of its history has been kind of erased without having the proper kind of restoration done. So we know that this was a historical building, and the building currently is in an interesting state between, I don't know, I had a fellow photographer call it a Frankenstein approach, where part of the building is still kind of in its rundown state, and other half, and the other parts of it have been completely modernized. So you have this kind of contrast of old and new, all within a very close space. This is a view of the rooftop and the outer facade. And so the Shuv Tower, again, this was the kind of this whole inspiration why I started doing working on this project. And in 2014, the Shukh Radio Tower, which was a symbol for many years of both radio and television, the owners had decided that the tower was in such a poor state that it immediately had to be demolished. And of course, there was a general outcry from the public. And it was actually a really interesting case where both there was a massive local campaign, but also an international campaign that was supporting the local campaign in their efforts to halt the demolition. And so about for 4 or 5 months, there was a wide range of different actions to bring attention to this tower. Here, people are collecting signatures against the demolition. An architectural watchdog, Akhnadzor, held many different rallies to draw attention to the fate of this tower. And so, and this is what the tower looks like. This was, I believe, yeah, last year. So the demolition ended up being canceled, which is very good news. But at the same time, it's been about 3 years since these actions that brought a lot of attention to the tower, and basically the government said, yes, this tower is important to us and we should do something about it. Still, not much has happened except the fact that the owners were forced to build what you can see inside of it, this support structure. Still, though, it's inconclusive what's going to happen with the tower. For now, it's still standing. And so this weekend is going to be, the Shukhov Tower is celebrating its 95 years since it first broadcast as radio waves. And it's, to me, always astounding that these monuments that are usually very well known abroad, and they're usually in all the architecture textbooks, here in Moscow are not paid the due respect in the sense that, you know, there's no financing for their restoration. Instead, we look at the monuments in such a state, and it's, you know, tourists come to see it and take photographs, but it's, you know, not falling apart, but it's, you know, as you can see, completely corroded. So it's also kind of a incomplete case. Melnikov House also is one of the most kind of well-known avant-garde monuments. And this building, like the Shukhov Tower and the Narkenfield building, also is has had a struggle with its condition and with the ownership of this building. A couple years ago, there was a construction site that's arose very close to the Melnikov House, and it's in the very center of Moscow, where a lot of new residential buildings are going up, a lot of office buildings are going up, and this has kind of basically enclosed the Melnikov House with high rises. It's not only a visual thing where you can't see the building, but basically it has been shaking up the soil, and so it's been negatively affecting the structure of the Melnikov House. And this photograph shows a building that I photographed from that was built in the 2000s that was also being affected by this construction site. So you can imagine what the building from the 2000s, how it is affected the Melnikov House, which, you know, was built sturdily, but also way back in 1929, how that would affect its structural integrity. Another, I guess, preservation challenge with these monuments is who owns the buildings. Melnikov House, for example, it was a private residence. It was built by the architect Konstantin Melnikov, and then his family lived there all during the Soviet period, and also into up until the present day, until 2014, when his granddaughter that had been living there was forced out by the Museum of Architecture. In Moscow, we had a kind of a split between the community who was really kind of unsure what was happening, where they were confused why the architect's granddaughter would be forced to vacate the house and the museum would take over. Again, I won't go into all the details because it's a little hard to explain a little bit, but for now we'll just look at some of the pictures. Excuse me. And to me, again, it's when I was witnessing kind of the drama that was unfolding around this house that's, you know, very well known, like the Narkenfield building or the Shukhov Tower. It's featured in many books on avant-garde. It's known, you know, it's fairly well known, but still there was such kind of this drama around it that to me it was surprising. I often heard people explain to me that, you know, Natasha, this is Moscow, you know, things like this happen, and to me it's, I'm still kind of getting used to it. I guess I'm not used to it at all. This is a picture, two pictures from the present day. The Monogov House is now operating as a museum, but still it hasn't, I guess the fallout from what happened a couple years ago hasn't been resolved. And yeah, it's also kind of a story that continues to unfold, like the other two buildings, Schuhof Tower and Northenfien. Here I've included a much lesser known building. So it was a telephone station that recently was demolished. And it was kind of if the Melanokov House, Schuhof Tower, and Northenfien building are fairly well known. This one was not, but it still raised quite a debate around the issue of the fate of constructivist buildings in Moscow. Basically, it was proposed to be demolished, and here you can see what they were. It's small, I'll show another picture later. They deemed that this building no longer had a purpose. It couldn't be saved because in a building with such kind of narrow windows, you couldn't, adapt it to a modern use. Moscow officials basically deemed this building as looking too utilitarian, and that it didn't match the neighborhood. And even though it had stood on the spot for the last 80 years, basically they said like it's too ugly to stand in the central part of Moscow. So it was slated for demolition. Preservation groups started to campaign and to inform the public of the significance of the building, what it meant historically, and actually it had quite a big resonance. They had several rallies in support of this building, and what was interesting to see is that it was it attracted a wide variety of people. It was not only kind of the usual people who attend these rallies who are architecture experts, but it was also students and also older people and people from this neighborhood. And it was an interesting thing to watch how people kind of united over this building that, like I said, it wasn't, this building wasn't too well known architecturally. Excuse me. And so this continued for a couple months, but unfortunately it was still, as the process had already started going, there was no way to stop it. And so it basically became kind of what I've been doing lately is documenting the demolition. And so people would come and watch how this building was slowly taken apart. Here we can see kind of a better picture of what is proposed to replace it, which is what city officials thought was a better choice. It's a luxury residential building done in kind of a historic style. And it's this kind of trend is kind of a fairly common one where new buildings are built in historical styles that, this is, I don't know if I can say it's like a neo art deco, more or less, that they see this as a beautiful, much more beautiful option than this kind of functional building. And so here's continuation of just during the whole time while this building was taken apart, people continued to try to rally support for it. But unfortunately it ended up being demolished. So I see we're about reaching about an hour. So I'll go through some of the pictures a little bit quicker. But these are just kind of, again, more examples of what's happening with these buildings where this was a constructivist neighborhood, a residential neighborhood. Again, deemed by officials unsalvageable. It would be too much money to restore it. And so it was slated for demolition. And it's these kind of neo-historical kind of buildings that are built in its place, much taller, about double height, maybe 3 times as high. Here we have the Dynamo Stadium that basically was demolished, maybe 3/4 of it, and on top of it they're building a superstructure. And this was seen as kind of a compromise where they would keep this front part of the building, this facade, what was kind of the most valuable, and then incorporate it into the new structure. We have here the Oak printing plant. This one is an interesting building for the fact that if a lot of people know the artist Elisitsky, they usually know him as kind of a graphic artist, but it turns out that he also there's a building that was built to his designs in Moscow. And this was only discovered in 2007 when the building was set on fire. Like I said, arson is a very common tactic. And basically the developer who was developing the land nearby wanted to get rid of this building. And so set it on fire. And unfortunately, unfortunately for them, but fortunately for the building, neighbors that knew of this building, they started kind of investigating what this building was. And they found out in the archives that this was one of Lisitsky's works. So unfortunately, it couldn't be demolished, but instead it was completely gutted, and last that I know was converted into a hotel, but I'm not sure what it is, if that actually happened. Here we have one of the bread factories, and these are the future plans. What actually has already started. They're building a residential complex around it. And what's interesting about this project is the developer on their website has mentioned, the significance of this bread factory. They've called it even like the dominant feature of this complex. And when you look at this render, you can see how dominant it is, or actually how not dominant it is. So it's kind of, again, showcases the attitude towards the constructivist architecture. Here we have the Pravda printing plant, also a huge building that has for the last 10 years sat vacant without being even sealed off from the winter elements. The picture on the right I took a couple months ago in the middle of winter, where you can see kind of the openings. So a lot of these buildings are not are just basically standing without getting the restored. Here we have a Ruskov building. It's kind of one of the few examples where actually it has undergone a restoration. This was a couple years ago, and this was last year. This Vestia building might be, I think, one of the few buildings that actually has undergone a restoration that has been deemed more or less successful. It hasn't been completed, but will be completed maybe in a couple months. And the Mosselprom building. And so you can see there, for the most part, the buildings are ignored. But there are a few cases when it is, promising that that they are being taken care of. And so here I'd like to present the case for renovation over demolition, incentives for and benefits of adapting the built environment for modern use and new functions. Preservation, I mean, economically, it's always seen as being time-consuming and very expensive, and especially in Moscow, where it's a lot easier to think about, quick profit, demolish, and then build a new building. It's really hard to make this case. But as Rem Koolhaas stated past year, preservation is a path forward. I really enjoy this quote where he said, "The beautiful thing about preservation is you begin with something that already exists and therefore is already local. And by definition, a preservation is an homage to earlier cultures and mentalities to which you can add a new dimension, a new function, a new beauty or appeal." And I think especially with the Avant-Garde, which began in Russia. It's a very it was the first time that actually like a Russian style was influencing Western architecture. It seems to me pretty logical that it should be better taken care of. It should be something that should be more, that on a local level should be, what should I say, should be more celebrated, I would say. Unfortunately, it's still kind of a unofficial level, a struggle to convince authorities why this architecture is important. And some questions that should be asked about these monuments is, what are these monuments? What purpose do they serve in modern days, modern times? Who should take care of it? Who should be fighting for them? Should it be the locals, or should it be kind of the official government organizations, like the Moscow Department of Cultural Heritage, whose job is to maintain the buildings? How do you do, conservation? Do you do reconstruction, restoration? How much of its historical fabric do you keep? How much do you have to change it so it's adaptable and can be used in modern times? And also why? Like, why do you keep it? Do you keep it to have an interesting looking building? Do you keep it to have a reminder of the past? All of these kind of questions are something to think about in approaching this architecture. Here I include 2 pictures of buildings that were demolished and reconstructed. This was the Moskva Hotel, right near Red Square, and the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. And the problem with these buildings is that to people who don't know the history, for them they see them as historical buildings, and whereas in effect they are replicas completely. And it gives you this false sense of history. You don't know what's real. It kind of is like a Disneyland effect, or a Las Vegas effect. You think that you're looking at a real building, and instead it's kind of a shell of something. And let's see. So this was an initiative to try to get developers more interested in investing in historical buildings, where they could acquire a building for a much lower price as long as they would restore it. This tactic hasn't been this offer hasn't been used for constructivist buildings, yes, but it has been applied to some buildings. For example, with the Narcan Film Building, I've kind of drawn parallels to the Isakon building in London, where this building also kind of suffered the same fate, where it was kind of abandoned. It was in a really terrible state, and then several years ago was completely renovated and has become a successful project, won an architecture an award for its restoration. And it's proved to be economically successful, where the apartments can be sold. And so it makes sense. You have an architectural landmark that is full of history, and Narcan is still kind of awaiting this fate. But there's examples of how it can be done. We have the Bekhmetsky bus garage, which was also renovated. So there's one example of where a constructivist building, which served a completely different purpose, which is a bus garage, is being used as a museum. This was a special case where it was a private investor that took this project on. We also have an example of the garage, not a constructivist building, but a building from about 70s, 80s that was recently renovated and now has been turned into a really interesting cultural space. This is the Red October factory, which has also undergone a process of being repurposed for, now it's a kind of a cultural cluster where it has different businesses and galleries. It's just to showcase that historical buildings, just because they can't be factories anymore, doesn't mean that they can't be part of the city's landscape. So let's see. Here we have it's bread factory, and recently it was vacated, and the new owners of this building actually really embraced the fact that it was a constructivist monument, that it was an industrial space, and they have on their website, they have completely used kind of the aesthetics, the spirit of the avant-garde to promote this building as going to be from its previous life as an industrial building to what it can be in the future. And it's basically going to be a cultural center where it's going to be kind of mixed use, where you have not only this historical building, but they've added shops to it, basically integrating this building. Instead of demolishing it and building a new structure, they're retaining this really interesting, yeah, here it is, interesting layout of the building. Thinking creatively, what efforts are being made to popularize avant-garde architecture? So this, I believe, is my last section, and I think, yeah, it is. So basically, I've kind of told you about this kind of not very positive what's been happening with these buildings, but in this section I'd like to share my experience and how this architecture has been promoted both locally and abroad. Kind of what people are doing to help raise awareness of the interesting facets of this history, and there are some things like special events. For example, last year with the World Monuments Fund, we did a Shukhov Tower Watch Day, where it was kind of a celebration of the tower's birthday, and there was a lecture and free excursions, and it's a way to educate the public about the significance of the tower. Here, there's also often exhibitions dedicated to the avant-garde, but as you can see, a lot of these are, we have New York, we have London, Mexico City, New York, and actually today a new exhibit called Imagine Moscow just opened in London. And to me it's really interesting because they are, it's about unrealized buildings, and I always kind of try to make the case for, I agree that these buildings are those projects that were left on paper are really fascinating, but to me it's really cool that you can actually go and visit buildings that were built, the actual built heritage of the avant-garde. And you can go and visit them. For example, this is the Narkenfield building. Now there's tours to the building. It's actually very, very popular with architecture students. I often get requests for visiting architects to go see the building. So it's really, really well known abroad. But unfortunately in 2017, the building still, after how many, if you do the math, how many years, 90 years, it hasn't had, 80 years, it hasn't had proper renovation. Recently this has kind of changed, and so in the future we might be expecting a restoration finally, but it's taken so long. While there's been always been so much interest in the building. Here's a night tour to the Shukhov Tower, where they were projecting kind of the history of this neighborhood on neighboring buildings. So it's kind of a creative approach to tours. There's also expeditions, excursions that go beyond Moscow, but are done by Moscow organizations. We have Moscow Through the Engineer's Eye, which is on the left. They took a trip to Yekaterinburg to look at Yekaterinburg's architecture. And on the right, the Avant-Garde Center took a trip to St. Petersburg to look at their architecture. There's also souvenirs. Again, coming from being raised in California, I was always kind of surprised that this architecture and actually the graphics of the avant-garde weren't used more often. It seems so visually interesting that I kind of assumed that there would be many more like souvenirs and posters and T-shirts with the buildings printed on them and with the graphics. This has only kind of picked up in the last couple of years, but it was, I kind of see it as a positive development in the fact that if you kind of keep seeing these visuals and you see the Shukhov Tower on this passport holder here, or the Melnikov House, hopefully that this will kind of, help prove the point to officials that these are symbols of the city, that they're an important part of the history. There's postcards, again, promoting these buildings. And in Yekaterinburg, because they have such a high percentage of constructivist buildings in the city, that they've actually kind of really embraced it and used kind of they were planning on possibly doing the logo of their city in kind of a constructivist style. An example of kind of the promotion for the telephone station that was demolished. I think all these kind of efforts are really important and to help remind of the buildings, of their significance. Of course, there's tons of books about the avant-garde, guidebooks, maps. Recently, with Blue Crow Media, London publisher, we did a constructivist map, Moscow map of Moscow, and it was, there are some maps, but there wasn't one that was geared towards tourists. And so it turned out that me with a kind of a Californian background and a London publisher were the ones to put together a map to discover Moscow's architecture, kind of as indicative of the case that it's still not as seen as something that should be pushed as a kind of tourist industry. Some more pictures from the map. And so basically, kind of in summation, this kind of what I've been doing for the last now 7 years can be summed up in this constructivist project, and kind of my desire to document, to track what's going on, to listen to other people's opinions of what they find interesting about the architecture, and kind of to be a bridge between people who are broader and are interested in the architecture and people who are experts who are in Moscow who know about the architecture. And so I've had I've had a website, I've had a Facebook page dedicated to it, I have an Instagram account dedicated to it. And so this past couple months, we've been actually working on a new website that would be kind of a better organized resource, kind of a way to help get more information about it. Because again, if these topics aren't discussed and aren't raised, it's a lot easier for these buildings to be forgotten and easier to be demolished. And so we're with the Avant-Garde Center in Moscow are putting together a database that's cataloging the buildings from the Avant-Garde. And one thing that's kind of not so well known is that not only Moscow had a huge percentage, of course, as the capital, but also constructivist architecture was built across all of Russia, but also across all of the Soviet Union. And so we're including buildings from lesser known cities that had constructivist architecture. And also to be kind of as a resource to people who are curious about the architecture and want to know more. There's different sections about the library. Like it'll include a library that includes printed works, so books, guidebooks, maps, sort of printed works about the avant-garde in both Russian and English languages. Also, an area that a calendar basically that will collect all the events that are on the avant-garde. So it's tours on the avant-garde, it's exhibitions that are going on in Moscow or in London. It's basically a way to have kind of a centralized resource for anything that deals with the avant-garde. And so we're approaching the end. This is all the ways to contact me. The first one's kind of the email if you have any questions, the website constructivistproject.com, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions. I know I've spoken for, oh my gosh, almost an hour and 15 minutes. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Natalia. I've seen this presentation before, but it gets better every time. So thanks for your time today, or this evening for you at least. I think to kick things off, I just wanted to remind people you can ask your question using the Q&A box or the chat box, and I'll keep an eye out for those questions. I don't see any yet, but I think I'll start with my own question. And
okay.
I was thinking of a few things as you were speaking, and the first thing that really hit my mind was the speed and pace of the loss of all of these structures recently. And you know, they've lasted approximately 80 years or so now, some of them, and all of a sudden they become threatened. And I'm wondering what you think has changed in Moscow and maybe in Russia in general that has contributed to this new sort of threatened status to these sites.
Well, I think when you think of Moscow, Moscow is a historical city, and I think when people come to visit, they kind of expect to see a historical city, and there's always this battle of which layers do you preserve of it, and kind of out of the list that I said, there's this attitude towards constructive architecture as not being as worthwhile, as not being as, you know, aesthetically pleasing or understandable, just because of its simplicity, just because it looks too industrial or too utilitarian, or I don't know, perhaps people see it as being too boring compared to more elaborate elaborate architecture. So I think it's both this kind of attitude or misunderstanding of why the architecture looks the way that it does, but then also kind of from the legal perspective, buildings that have these, you know, not only constructivist buildings, but that have a status. Their status can be easily revoked and removed, and it's kind of unclear how this process works. So there's no transparency or no accountability for kind of the mechanisms that work for what gets decided to be demolished or not. I don't know if somewhere in there I answered your question, John.
I think it did, and maybe as sort of a follow-up, the other thing I was curious about was how regulations in the U.S. and Moscow differ, if you're aware of how preservation regulations work here, and second, how incentives for historic preservation work in Moscow compared to here. I mean, are there government efforts to support preservation monetarily or otherwise? And on the flip side, are there government regulations in place to help stop some of this?
So actually, when I was in San Francisco in the fall, and I was talking to an architect friend of mine, and I was actually asking him the question, because again, I don't have like a preservation background, so I was kind of, you know, trying to get all the information out of him. What were the codes? What were the different methods, regulations that were in San Francisco? And what he was describing was kind of unheard of to me, because he was saying how strict it was to get approvals, all the different zoning. And in Moscow, it seems like if maybe there's an idea of this, it's definitely not enforced, and that's kind of the biggest issue where. There's not even, if we're trying to have a campaign to save a building, to, you know, explain why it's significant, that's one front, but the other front is to be able to say that, oh, it's in a protected area in central Moscow where, you know, this historical fabric can't be touched. From my experience, that does not work here. And that's a major issue that, like, from a legal framework, these regulations, if they exist somewhere, they're definitely not observed.
Oh, great. Okay. We did have one question, actually two questions come in, and I'll start with the most recent one. We have a question asking, how do you compare and contrast the threats to earlier constructivist places and modernist mid-century places in Russia, California, and elsewhere, as both as both don't always resonate with the public based on their looks, form, etc. And if you want to read that question, you can see it in the Q&A box.
Okay, let me read. Well, okay, so kind of this struggle, this fight to try to save constructivist architecture is kind of well known, but there's also a parallel fight for kind of the second wave, of modernist architecture in Russia. That was in the 70s and 80s, and that some people say is even more at threat in the sense that since it's more recent, it doesn't have as much. It's not as old, so it's a lot more vulnerable. Whereas at least with constructivist architecture, we're nearing on a century of existence, so it has just kind of this slightly advantage of added value of that it's been around longer. How it compares to, I guess, with maybe in the U.S. or in California. Again, I kind of know more about the situation in Russia, but I think I've seen kind of the same trend where this architecture that, brutalist architecture, anything done like in an international style, for me as an architect, as an architectural photographer, I find them just absolutely beautiful. But it wasn't always the case. Before, I didn't look at the buildings as closely, and from my own experiences, because I didn't know about them, I didn't know what was the reasons for the buildings to look the way that they looked, to be designed so geometrically, so simply why they were built out of concrete. And so I think it's a common struggle to, if you don't know about the architecture, if you don't know about the reasons for its aesthetics, for the way that they look, that it's harder. I mean, it's easier just kind of to brush it off and not kind of give them the value that they deserve.
Great. And then another question came in about is it the Centroyes building? Is it Corbusier? I think she's mentioning the Corbusier building that you mentioned earlier, and what the status. What is its reputation among Moscow architects?
So what is the fate and the reputation? So it's still standing. It is, I think I didn't mention, is that the fate of buildings that are occupied by a government organization fare a lot better than things that are residential, because they're better kept during their lifetime. And it's interesting to use, since it was built by Corbusier. I think that also definitely affords its, it's because it was the only one built by Corbusier in Moscow. It is not more famous, but it is definitely a lot more special in that sense. Among Moscow architects, I don't know. I think everybody kind of obviously recognizes it as a monument, as kind of a masterpiece. I know when I was photographing, and I think one of the first few times I had approached the building, and security guards kind of came out and asked why I was doing this, because this is, it's a government building, so a little bit more wary of people photographing it. And I had to kind of explain to them, like, of course, this is built by Corbusier. It's a very famous architectural monument. And like I said, often I'm having to kind of give a architectural lesson to people who question why you would find this kind of building interesting. But among, I think, architects, it's undoubtedly, very much respected, very much admired.
Great. The final question, we still have time for questions if anybody else has any, so please do. This is your last chance to ask it. But there was one more question, and it was related to how to find your website and the project. And I answered it by text, but maybe you can repeat to people that's probably better. Show them where to find more information.
So the project is fairly easy to find. I know the name is rather long to type out, the Constructivist Project, but basically if you even type in the Constructivist Project in Google, it'll come up with the Facebook page, with the website. Currently, the old version of the website is up. Planning to release the new website, which will be the new and improved catalog that covers architecture, constructivist architecture across all of the former Soviet Union. That's going to be maybe in about a month's time, in middle of April or so. So.
Okay.
Mhm.
Great. Well, thanks for your time today. And I will remind everybody that's logged in, please do fill out the survey. It's pasted into the chat box and it'll open in a separate window. Oh, it looks like there's one more question. So while I'm reminding people to take the survey, we can answer this final question. And the question is, as I recall, the constructivist buildings were very poorly built due to lack of skills and lack of materials. Would you agree with that or not disagree?
I would disagree, partially agree, but disagree. There was, because, I mean, during their time, this was after the revolution, after the Russian Civil War, because of the economic hardships, there was kind of lack of materials, and the architects who were designing the buildings had to be very innovative in the materials that were used. So it's kind of a common excuse that I guess some developers who are viewing to demolish constructivist building would say that they were built out of poor quality materials, whereas that might be the case. Maybe some of the insulation, this kind of buildings like the Lysikon building in London or the Bauhaus that were in a poor shape. I mean, there's methods for dealing with this kind of materials, with these type of constructions, and so it's a matter if you are going to invest in kind of restoring the building. So yeah, I would tend to disagree to that.
Great, thank you. That was enlightening. Okay, so I will remind people again, please check the chat box for that link to the survey. And one final word of thanks to Natalia. Thanks for your time, and I hope you sleep well tonight. And enjoy the birthday party of the Zhukov Tower.
Yep, weekend.
This weekend. And thanks again for your time. So I'm going to leave the screen up, but I'm going to mute and disable our screens and just leave the window open for people to take that survey. But thanks again for joining us today. And if you aren't a member, please do become a member and take a look at Natalia's website. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.